A grieving cowboy saved a dying girl from the dust. But when she revealed her name, his world turned upside down. Rhett Callahan had been riding under a merciless sun across the barren plains, his horse's hooves lifting ochre dust, and his heart as empty as the land after losing his wife 2 years ago. Something in the wavering heat drew his gaze to a shape half buried in dust. A young woman, slumped against a weathered fence post, as if the land itself had rejected her. Her skin was cracked and bleached by the sun's relentless rays, her dark hair matted and tangled with grit, and one leg lay bent at a grotesque angle, evidence of an old grievous injury that had festered untreated. Flies clustered around the corners of her pale lips, crawling over sunburned flesh, yet she seemed almost statuesque in exhaustion, as if she had surrendered her claim on life. Rhett's breath caught in his throat, an ache he thought buried with his grief stirred unexpectedly in his chest. He dismounted, uncertainty and something like hope warring behind his steady blue eyes, then knelt beside her, his heart thundering at the sound of her shallow breathing. Gently, he brushed a strand of dusty hair from her face, feeling the heat radiate from skin so parched it seemed brittle, and offered a canteen of water he had carried for himself. Her eyelids fluttered, one dull green orb opened, rimmed with sorrow and stubborn defiance, and she spat out a bitter curse that sounded as raw as the land itself. "Ain't none of your business." But Rhett would not turn away. He knelt, offering the canteen again, and watched her lips crack open to drink, as if that cool water might breathe life back into her broken body. Each desperate gulp she took seemed to lift a weight from her throat, but her grip on the canteen was so weak it threatened to slip from her fingers, reminding him how fragile a human could become when left alone in the wilderness. "You need more than water," Rhett murmured, though no doctor lived for miles around, only him, a man who had not tended a sick soul since the day his wife Mary closed her eyes to the world. "Ain't nobody around to fix what I got," she rasped, her gaze flicking away as if ashamed to be discovered in so pitiful a state. Rhett slid an arm beneath her shoulders despite the haze of pain in her weak protests. Her body was as light as a rag, yet he carried her with the weight of both urgency and compassion. Her ragged men's coat hung from her frame like a funeral shroud, and a faded scarf, once a bright cheerful pattern, draped around her neck, its colors blurred by sweat and dust, a silent testimony to a life reduced to ruin. As he lifted her, her weight settled against him like a burden he did not want, yet could not refuse to bear. He arrived at his ranch, a modest cabin of rough-hewn cedar planks weathered by seasons of sun and wind, and carried her inside like a secret. Every step inside, his boots creaking on wooden floor, felt like an echo of the silent life he had chosen. He set her down on the cot, hearing the soft rasp of fabric, and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since his wife's funeral, an old hymn to bridge life and death. The air smelled of hay and worn leather, mingling with the tang of fear clinging to her clothes. As he held water to her lips, he wondered if she would forgive him for saving her and learn to trust again after all she had lost. When she finally stirred, fear burned in her eyes as she whispered, "You gon' kill me now?" He met her eyes, recognizing in them his own fear reflected back, the fear of being left alone to face a world that had already taken everything he loved. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I ain't one to kill a soul dying in the dust." She shook her head, tears carving clean trails through the grime on her cheeks, and whispered, "I ain't no soul and I sure ain't gonna live." Her resignation cut through him like a blade. How could someone so young surrender to such darkness? He fetched a bowl of warm broth, its steam rising in the dim light of an oil lamp he lit, the flicker casting long shadows across empty pens, where cattle would soon stir uncertain of this wounded stranger. He set the bowl before her and knelt, watching as she lifted it with trembling fingers, her lips parting to sip. He thought of Mary's laughter filling their home and realized this soul had awakened hope and compassion he feared gone. When her gaze met his, fear lingered but a spark of curiosity glowed, and Rhett knew their lives would never stay the same. In that quiet dawn, the ranch felt alive with possibility and dread, as if the land itself held its breath to see what they would become. Rhett laid her on the only clean cot, the tack room floor, and spent a long sleepless night, tending her fever. It felt as though the world had shrunk to that dimly lit room, where the scent of sweat, damp blankets, and linseed oil mingled. He wet a cloth in cold spring water, wrung it out until droplets clung to the fibers, and pressed it against her flushed forehead. Each time flies buzzed around her, she flinched, as though they were tiny demons stealing her last breath. He coaxed a spoonful of warm broth past her lips, broth made from a deer's bones and wild thyme, to nourish her starving body. She moaned, cursed the spoon, and slapped at the air, as if denying hunger itself. In her delirium, she muttered fragments of memory, a cabin aflame, voices shouting, a sister's scream. He listened, heart aching with every broken word, thinking of his wife Mary, and the darkness that had taken her. When dawn came, pale and cold, she opened her eyes with a glare that burned hotter than the sun. "You're going to kill me next, ain't you?" she rasped. He shook his head. "No, I'm not a killer," but she turned away, jaw clenched, refusing to meet his gaze. For days she fought him at every turn. He offered cornbread, black coffee sweetened with molasses, and cured ham. She pushed it aside, insisting she didn't want his pity. He slept in a chair beside her cot, his eyes stinging from watching the thin rise and fall of her chest as she struggled for each breath. Sometimes, her cough would rattle through the quiet cabin, harsh and wet, and it pained him to hear her body betray her, each spasm amplifying the horror in her fevered ramblings. In the stillness, he remembered Mary's laughter echoing through these same cabin walls, before the silence swallowed her life. During the day, he carved a cane for her from a cedar branch, the scent of fresh wood filling the barn, and each shaving that fell felt like a piece of his own sorrow shaved away. He focused on the smooth curves and sturdy handle, imagining her grasping it and finding her balance again. When he brought the cane to her at dawn, she tested its weight, as though it were a burden too heavy to bear. "I don't need it," she snapped, but her foot shook, and he guided her hand around the handle. She stood, limping heavily, the cane pressing into her palm like a fragile promise. He fetched a pair of old leather boots, hoping to shield her wounded foot, but she shook her head and pushed them away, as though they were shackles. With nothing but the clothes on her back, she hobbled onto his 600-acre ranch, each step a painful testament to her brokenness. He followed silently as she made her way to the barn, her shoulders stiff and arms trembling. The land rolled gently with grasses, and distant mountains, dusted with snow, stared back like silent witnesses. Horses in stalls nickered softly, their breath steaming in the morning chill, and he watched as she paused in the barn doorway, leaning against a hay bale like a reluctant ally. He saw her pain in every tremor of her hands, and every hitch in her breath. She cursed the heat, the flies, and the pain in her leg, as though each were a living enemy. When a sudden summer storm rolled in, gray clouds racing across the sky, thunder rattled the barn walls, and she cowered as though the sky itself sought to punish her. Lightning sliced the air, and she squeezed her eyes shut, whispering hymns under her breath, as if the words could keep the darkness at bay. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," her voice so faint it trembled through the rafters. As days passed, he saw small signs of hope. She sat up without collapsing, tasted a spoonful of stew, and walked across the barn, without her legs giving way. One morning dew clung to the grass, and birds chattered in the corral as she pushed open the barn door, and stepped into the yard without help, her eyes holding a spark he hadn't seen before, curiosity or defiance. She stumbled, fell against a fence post, caught her breath, then limped back inside, to the shelter of shadows, where she felt safe from the open sky. Inside she knelt by a trough, scooping water to her lips with trembling hands before dragging herself to her cot. He tried to remind her of food and water, each time she turned away, insisting she could find her own way again. But each morning she drank the water he left in a bucket, and each evening, he found her lying on the cot, wrapped in clean blankets, the faint smell of pine from the cedar he had used for the cane, lingering in the air. He mended fences, and tended cattle, but always circled back to check on her, listening for her song or her labored breath. He tried politely to learn why she had been in the dust, if she had no home, where she came from, what tragedy had stolen her. Each question was met with a tightening of her jaw and a refusal of her eyes to meet his, the silence between them thicker than the midday heat. Still he persisted, leaving herbs and bandages at her bedside, watching how she treated them, with suspicion, as though each bandage might conceal betrayal. She stayed alive only to ensure whatever had driven her into the wilderness wouldn't have the final say. Nightmares plagued her sleep. She would cry out in terror, clutch at the sheets drenched in sweat, and he would be at her side, soothing her with a gentle hand, until her tears subsided, and exhaustion claimed her again. He watched her struggle against her own mind, fighting ghosts he could not name, and it haunted him more than his own losses. Day by day, stitch by stitch, word by unspoken word, they forged a fragile routine. He cared for her wounds. She stayed alive. Beneath that routine, something shifted, an unspoken curiosity, stretching between them like a slender thread. He wondered what memory she held on to when she slept, burning wood, a dying sister, or a whispered name that echoed through her dream. She wondered if he would ever truly understand her pain, or if he would abandon her once the last of her strength had faded. On the seventh day, he watched her stand in the dawn light, the sky painted with pale pinks and soft purples, melting into gold. She paused, breathing in colors she hadn't noticed in so long, as though the world had come alive again. When she turned to look at him, there was something unspoken in her gaze, weariness, and a tremor of hope, mixing like fire and ice. In that moment, the ranch no longer felt empty, and neither did his heart, which had begun to open despite the ghosts he carried. And though neither would admit it, they had become more than rescuer and survivor. They were companions in a silent fight for life and mercy, each keeping guard over their wounds, while inching closer to a truth neither could fully name. As dusk fell, he noticed the ranch dogs paused by the door, sensing her growing strength. Wind whispered through the pines, like a secret, and Rhett felt that maybe life held a promise beyond pain. One night thunder rumbled across the plains, as though the sky itself was beating its fists against the earth. And June Mercy Harlan lay curled near the fire, inside Rhett Callahan's simple cabin, her injured leg throbbing so fiercely that each pulse felt like a small explosion in her bones, while the rain began to patter on the tin roof, and drafts of cold air whispered through the cracks in the wooden walls. But sleep could not find her. She gazed into the flames, haunted by memories too painful to voice. She remembered the acrid smell of smoke as flames consumed her family's homestead, the look of terror in her sister's eyes when the first shot rang out, and the roar of men's voices shouting orders as they set fire to the barn. When the fire reached the beams above her head, she had felt a searing heat that burned through her clothes and left her skin raw, but her sister had pushed her to safety, sacrificing herself so that June could crawl to the hills and escape. In that moment, June's heart felt as though it might shatter, and every time thunder cracked overhead, it felt like the old wounds tore open again. Rhett, who had been tending his work by the window, saw her restless shifting and finally stepped close, concern etched on his weathered face. He broke the hush by asking gently if she missed anyone, and June's eyes burned with unshed tears as she hesitated before answering. My sister. That tiny confession hung in the air like a blade poised to strike, cutting through the distance she had built around herself in those long weeks of silence. Rhett said nothing, just moved a chair closer to her cot, and sat wrapped in the flickering glow of candlelight, his heart pounding with a mix of compassion and curiosity, wondering what more she carried inside. When dawn arrived pale and grey, June fainted as though her body could no longer bear the weight of her own memories, and Rhett held vigil through the morning, shotgun across his lap, as thunderclouds still clustered in the sky outside, refusing to leave her side as if guarding both her life and her secret. Each flash of lighting illuminated the determination in his eyes, and when she finally stirred, her breath shallow and ragged, she looked at him with a trembling vulnerability before confessing her name. June Mercy Harlan. She explained in clipped, haunted words that her family had been outlaws, who once roamed these plains, and that her sister, braver and wilder than any man, had led them through dangers that would have broken lesser souls. But when a powerful cattle baron named Clayton Roach began to cover his own crimes by accusing them of cattle rustling, he rode into their valley with a band of men, torched their home to the ground, and killed her sister in the flames to silence the only witness who could speak the truth. June's voice cracked as she described how she had stumbled away into the hills, determined to hunt Roach and make him pay for what he had done, but her leg had given out after days of bleeding and exhaustion, and she had crept into the dust near the fence post ready to die where no one could find her. Rhett's silence at this confession was not a judgment, but something deeper, an empathy that transcended words, as if he too carried a burden of grief that no light could ever erase. For a long moment they simply stared at each other in the hush before she nodded slightly, a slow movement that meant she would accept his help to walk again, even if she did not fully trust that mercy. A flicker of hope lit her hollow eyes, and for the first time since she arrived on his ranch, her shoulders relaxed just enough to show that she might still choose to live. Over the following weeks, as the summer sun moved toward its zenith and golden grasses rippled on the prairie like a sea in the wind, June's steps grew steady. Rhett fashioned braces from leather straps and splintered wood so her leg would stop collapsing beneath her, and though each attempt to stand left her gasping for breath and tears streaming down her cheeks, he murmured encouragements, until she believed she could do it. The mornings found them in the corral. She sat side saddle at first, her face set with determination as she held onto the pommel and tested her balance, her fingers white-knuckled around the leather. He led the horse, walking slowly, never letting her shift weight too quickly. The sun rose sharply overhead, bathing the scene in harsh gold, and wind stirred dust at their boots, as June leaned forward, closing her eyes to imagine the freedom of self-propelled movement. With each labored breath she felt a mix of fear and longing, fear that her leg would betray her again, and longing for the moment when she might ride toward vengeance. Rhett watched her progress, pride and protectiveness mingling in his chest like two storm clouds about to collide. He thought of all the miles she would still have to ride to catch Clayton Roach, and wondered if the road could heal her, or if it would break her altogether. By late summer, when the fields blazed amber and the crickets sang in the dusk, June stood tall in the saddle, though each step of the horse beneath her made her limbs tremble with memory and pain. Her sister's name was an unspoken promise carried in the wind as she looked out toward the distant hills, where Roach hideouts lay hidden among rocky outcroppings, and curiosity danced in her eyes as she imagined confronting him. Rhett's voice was soft but firm when he placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "You're ready." She turned to him, gratitude and sorrow mixing in her gaze, and for a moment neither needed words. The canyon beyond beckoned with both danger and the chance for closure, and as lighting still flickered on the far horizon, June Mercy Harlan, once lost to pain and despair, felt a fierce determination kindle within her chest like a brand, ready to follow it wherever it might lead. They left the safety of the ranch, riding toward the hills where Roach's influence spread like a dark stain across the land, their horses stepping carefully over rocky ground that cracked under their hooves like broken promises. June Mercy Harlan sat tall in the saddle, her crippled leg strapped to a worn leather brace that still trembled as the horse beneath her moved, each jolt sending a flare of pain through her bones. And Rhett Callahan walked beside her horse, his hand never far from his rifle, but his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of concern and pride. The plains behind them swirled in waves of golden grass, but ahead lay darker truths, outlaw camps, hidden hideouts, and the ghost of Clayton Roach's cruelty in every burned fence post and abandoned homestead they passed. June trained with a rifle that Rhett had once used for rabbit hunting, and each morning before the sun had climbed high, she rose from the rough blankets where she lay on the ground outside a shabby camp, her legs stiff and aching, and hoisted the heavy weapon to her shoulder. Her hands shook so badly she wondered if she would drop the rifle into the dust, but she forced herself to focus on her breathing, and her sister's last words before the flames took her away. Her breathing was shallow, her heart pounding like a drum, as she sighted along the barrel, took aim at a wooden target he had set against a battered barrel, and pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed against the hills, and the target shuddered from the impact as though it too felt her vengeance. Rhett stood behind her, calling out advice when her aim faltered, his voice steady and soft, reminding her that each shot brought her closer to the justice she had sworn to find. Weeks passed in a blur of dawn's cold light and twilight's fading glow, as they rode deeper into Roach's territory. June's leg improved with every struggle, though each day the muscles in her thigh and calf burned from the strain, and each step toward vengeance felt like a necessary agony. The dusty wind carried shards of memory, her sister's laughter in summer fields, the crackle of burning timber, and the roar of angry men's voices. When they reached Blacktail, a half-dead mining town where rusted ore carts lay abandoned on tracks that led into yawning shafts, June's eyes hardened as the town appeared under a sky streaked with bruised purples and greys. The wind stirred broken boards against sagging storefronts, and the distant howl of a dog echoed down an empty street. Blacktail had one saloon and nothing else that mattered, and as they approached, the sun sank low, making long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across cracked wooden sidewalks. June limped down from her horse, the weight of her booted foot reminding her that each step was a triumph, and she felt the eyes of strangers on her cane, and her scarred face. Rhett followed more slowly, watching her back with a silent promise that he would not let her face Roach's men alone. The saloon door swung open with a creak that seemed too loud in the stillness, and inside, June saw Clayton Roach sitting behind a rough wooden table, where cards and empty whiskey bottles lay in a careless mess. His gaze wandered over her face, as though she was a curiosity he did not recognize, and his lips curled into a smirk when she did not answer his questions. The saloon stank of stale smoke and sweat, and the air was thick with the tension of men who sensed something dangerous in her quiet step. When his smug laughter filled the room as he mocked her in a low voice, June's breath hitched and a flash of memory tore through her mind, her sister at his mercy, flames dancing around the cabin, and injustice burning its mark upon her soul. She stood slowly, her rifle in her hand, and walked toward him like a ghost resurrected from the ashes. Roach looked up, amused at first, until June whispered his name, Roach, and then the laughter died on his lips as his eyes widened in recognition. He tried to scramble from his chair, but June seized him by the collar and dragged him outside onto the porch where the last rays of sunlight lingered like dying embers. The town seemed to hold its breath as she looked at him, and for a moment Roach's arrogance faltered under the heat of her gaze. She raised her rifle and shot him through the thigh, the ball tearing through flesh and making him collapse with a howl that echoed down the empty street. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath him, a crimson warning to anyone who might follow. Before Roach could plead for mercy, she fired again, this time shattering his wrist, and sending him into a rage of pain. But she did not kill him. She knelt, pressing her face close to his, and whispered, "Mercy is what people remember worse than death," and then she left him bleeding and broken in the dirt, the sunset painting his agony in shades of red and gold. Rhett helped her mount her horse, each movement a testament to her growing strength, and as they rode away, whispers spread through the mines and saloons like wildfire. The girl he thought he'd burned alive had returned, riding a horse with a crippled leg, and a rifle that carried her sister's final justice. Fear took root among Roach's men, for they knew that if June Mercy Harlan could find him in Blacktail, she could find any of them, who had torched her home or stood by in silence, as her sister died. With each mile they left behind, the plains seemed to hum with her name, carrying her story across the wind-swept horizons, and though her heart still bore the scars of loss, a new purpose burned within her, to strike fear into every man who had turned her world to ashes, to remind them that even a broken body could deliver a merciless blow, and to show the world that vengeance wrapped in mercy cut deeper than any bullet. They felt a chill even when the sun burned on their shoulders. June's mind raced with memories of her sister's smile, how she braided hair on summer mornings, and the echo of her laughter as they ran across fields. Emotions swirled in June's chest, anger so fierce it burned, sorrow so deep it crashed like waves. Rhett glanced at her, seeing her jaw clenched with pain and resolve. He knew she carried more than a rifle, she carried a story needing justice. When wind whistled through canyon walls or rustled sage, June paused, closed her eyes and searched for a sign her sister's spirit rode beside her. Other times wind brought whispers of a girl who vanished in flames and returned unbowed. Every rumor stitched itself into her resolve like a badge of honor. Rhett felt their world shrink to the two of them. As they neared Roach territory, June's heart pounded with fear and fierce determination. She looked at Rhett, and knew that though her leg was weak, her spirit was unbroken. Under a twilight sky the color of bruised plums, they rode toward legend, leaving behind the memory of a girl who refused to die. Winter's harsh wind blew sideways, freezing flesh and steel alike, as June Mercy Harlan and Rhett Callahan pressed deeper into the unforgiving wilderness to confront those who had stolen her life. The landscape was a sea of white, the ground glazed with ice and snow drifting in sharp drifts that clung to gnarled trees and broken fence posts, like nature's own scars. Each breath June drew felt like shards of glass cutting her lungs, yet her spirit burned hotter than any furnace, driving her forward despite her body's agony. The sky above was a pale iron, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the reckoning to come. They tracked Sheriff Henry Griggs first, finding him drunk and unconscious in the dim jail cell of a lonely mining town, his shirt stained with cheap whiskey and regret. Frost formed on the walls, and a faint drip of water echoed off stone as June approached with silent fury. In her hand she carried a small bundle, a single braid of her sister's hair, singed by flame and heavy with memory. When she laid it on the cold wooden desk, the sheriff's drunken smirk twisted into a mask of horror. "You think that will save you?" he slurred at first, but when June spoke his name and reminded him of the screams he ignored on the night her home burned, his knees buckled. His denial turned to panic as he saw the truth in her eyes. She knew of his betrayal, the lies he told to cover a crime against her family. She left him tied at the hitchpost outside, the braid nailed above his head like a silent warning to any who would hide behind a badge, his fearful wails echoing in the night as wolves howled in the distance. Next, they made their way to the muddy riverbank, where Reverend Malden, a man who had twisted his words to curse June's family from the pulpit, waited in false sanctimony. His church once rang with hymns about mercy and love, but he preached that her sister's death was God's judgment, refusing hope to those who needed it most. June found him kneeling beside the half-frozen stream, his hands clutching a well-worn Bible as though its pages could wash away his sin. When she appeared in his shadow, he recoiled, but June stepped close until he saw the anguish shining in her eyes. She spoke of the prayers he never offered for her dying sister and shot his foot with deliberate calm. The gunshot rang across the frozen water, and the Reverend howled as blood seeped into the ice. She backed away, leaving him to stumble back to his church with a limp that would remind him of his cruelty every day. Rhett watched without hesitation, his jaw clenched in grim approval as the cold took hold around them. But vengeance came with a price. They paused by a canyon at Thorn Hollow under a steel-gray sky, where the wind howled through jagged cliffs like hungry ghosts. This was the lair of the last of June's tormentors, a gang of men who had cheered as her home burned and her sister died. Under a canopy of gnarled pines, they spotted a broken-down cabin, smoke curling from a chimney like a signal of betrayal. As they approached, a scout raised the alarm, and bullets ripped through the air with savage speed. Rhett's hat spun off his head as a round grazed his shoulder, searing pain lighting his face. June's heart pounded as she dove into a shallow ditch, her body slipping into mud that stained her uniform. Blood and dirt mixed in her mouth when a piece of shrapnel nicked her cheek, but she raised her rifle without hesitation. Each shot she fired rang out like thunder, slicing through the rage that had built inside her. Rhett leapt from cover and charged a man advancing on June with a swift move. He plunged his blade home, ending the fight in a storm of snow and blood. As the last gunman fell, an eerie quiet settled over Thorn Hollow, broken only by the howl of the wind. The storm deepened, and June's body weakened. Fever roared through her veins like molten iron, and her bones ached as though twisted by frost. Nights were torture. Wrapped in furs inside a battered canvas tent, she lay shivering as fevered nightmares washed over her, faces of burning wood and her sister's terrified eyes haunting every dream. In the pale lantern light, she clutched a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, her hand shaking as she fought to write down memories before they vanished like smoke on the wind. Each word cost her a gasp, but she refused to let her sister's story die. Rhett sat close, pressing a cup of warm broth to her lips and whispering that she must rest, but June shook her head, fear twisting her voice. If she slept too long her memories would be gone forever, taking her sister with her. As dawn bled through the canvas, June awoke with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, her body a battlefield of pain and determination. Rhett wrapped her in furs and carried her to a ledge overlooking Thorn Hollow, where she stared out at the valley of snow, her spirit unbroken though her flesh was weak. The wind carried echoes of vengeance and mercy entwined, and June felt a strange seed of something new bloom inside her chest, the knowledge that while justice could be cruel, her sister's memory deserved more than hatred alone. In the frozen stillness, she resolved to live, to carry forward the legacy of love behind her rage, even as winter's bitter grasp threatened to claim her. Rhett watched her falter yet rise each dawn, his concern shadowed by awe at her unbroken. In that frozen night they became kindred spirits bound by law. The snow turned fields to white silence. Only 3 names remained. The last man, once a boy, now a silver mine owner, with a family, lived like a king. June stood at the edge of his porch, the rifle shaking in her hands, wind biting through her ragged clothes. She hesitated. He didn't even remember her. Still, she shot his arm, or so she meant. The lantern dropped. He crumpled, half blind with pain. She didn't kill him but left him broken in the snow, the first flicker of pity in her heart. Her vengeance was complete, but its cost weighed like an anchor. By the time they reached the train station at dawn, June could barely stand. Rhett carried her into the warm coach car, a world away from the harsh plains. Though they tried cities, their memories were too heavy. People stared at her cane, at Rhett's grief-carved face, so they bought a wagon and headed north, building a cabin beside a narrow stream, a place where 2 broken souls could breathe without fear. The creek's water raced over smooth stones, as though eager to wash away old sins. Inside, June lay on a simple cot beside the hearth, her leg propped on a bundle of blankets to ease its ache. Rhett stepped outside each morning, checking traps for rabbits and tending a small patch of potatoes. The smell of pine and moss wrapped around their cabin, a silent reminder that life could grow again, even after devastation. June watched him from the doorway, her fingers tracing the fretwork he carved into the wooden wall. She remembered her sister's laughter, echoing through this same forest, and tears blurred her vision when she recalled the day the fire swallowed her family's home. Rhett would return with a handful of mushrooms or a bird he'd hunted, and June would force herself to eat, tasting the warmth of survival for the first time since that night of ash and flames. Each bite felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Their days passed slowly, Rhett mending tools under the afternoon sun, June attempting to write her sister's story, her hand trembling so the letters smudged on rough paper. Sometimes she'd stop and let the pencil fall, her eyes lost in the ripples where minnows darted beneath the water's surface. Rhett would sit beside her, offering a gentle word or a touch so light it felt like a promise. Winter came early, icing the stream and frosting the cabin windows with fern patterns that glowed when dawn arrived. June wrapped herself in furs, Rhett draped around her shoulders, and they watched smoke curl from their chimney, marking their home in a sea of white. She felt a strange peace in that frozen world, as though each breath of cold air cleansed her heart of anger. Yet every so often she would pause at the window, staring toward the distant hills where Clayton Roach's shadow once ruled. Her sister's face flickered in her mind, smiling, defiant, and June wondered if forgiveness could be found in a heart so long hardened by pain. Rhett would catch her gaze and smile gently, reminding her that mercy did not erase justice, but offered a path forward. Spring's first promise came as a single green shoot pushing through snowmelt. June knelt by the stream's edge, cupping water in her hands, and tasting it, letting the cold revive her spirit. Rhett arrived with a basket of wild strawberries, their bright sweetness echoing the hope growing in June's chest. She brushed a berry across her sister's braid, now framed on the mantel, and whispered a vow that her family's memory would fuel more than vengeance. It would inspire compassion. The hilly terrain around their cabin bloomed with lupine and daisy, and June joined Rhett in planting seedlings for a vegetable garden. Each seed she laid in the thawing earth felt like a whisper to the future. Life could sprout from the ashes of sorrow. They built a simple fence to keep deer from eating tender shoots, and evenings found them sitting by the fire, June strumming a battered guitar, Rhett found in an abandoned shack. Music filled the cabin, fragile and bright, as she sang old hymns for her sister, and new songs for the life they were building. Their routine grew steady, dawn hikes to check traps, afternoons sketching maps of the land, and twilight conversations about dreams they dared not speak before. June wondered if the world beyond their forest still hummed with fear of her name, but each day of peaceful silence answered her doubts. One afternoon, a stranger arrived, a one-armed veteran, eyes sunken but not broken, seeking shelter from a blizzard. Rhett and June welcomed him, tended his wounds, and listened as he spoke of battles he could no longer face at home. That night June watched him sleep, and she felt a kinship deeper than blood. Other souls broken by life's cruelty could heal here. In the months that followed, more travelers braved the snow to find June's refuge, a girl scarred by fire, a mother who lost her child to a disease that swept through towns, a young boy whose father never returned from a raid. Each found Mercy's Hollow, a name Rhett carved into a wooden sign hung beside their door. Around a roaring fire, they shared stories of loss and hope, and June offered words of comfort she once thought impossible. You are not defined by what was taken, your heart still beats for love. Rhett taught them to hunt and plant, June showed them how to forge strength from sorrow. In the garden, daisies bloomed next to broccoli, wildflowers leaning towards summer's sun. At dawn, mist rose from the stream, swirling around their cabin like spirits dancing to a prayer. June walked to her sister's grave beyond a low rise, where a simple wooden cross bore her name. Rhett stood quietly behind, understanding that each step June took there was a step toward healing. She knelt, placing a fresh bouquet of lupine at the foot of the cross, and whispered, "I've found mercy, little sister, I've found a way to live." As sunlight broke through drifting clouds, the frost melted on the cross, and June felt warmth blossom in her chest. Rhett slipped his hand into hers, and together they watched the world awaken, birds calling for mates, trees bursting with green, and the narrow stream carving new paths through thawed earth. Life rippled in every direction, a testament to the choice they made, to forgive, to rebuild, to carry forward what they loved rather than what they lost. Mercy's Hollow flourished, a refuge where broken souls discovered they could stand tall again. In that place of peace, June felt her sister's spirit dancing in the sunbeams, free from pain at last.
Years passed. June's body slowly gave out. Infection in her leg, pain traveling through her hands, until she could no longer write. One quiet morning, Rhett found her rifle across her lap, eyes fixed on distant peaks, but her chest no longer rose. He buried her by the stream, marking her grave with her cane and the last bullet she never used. On the cabin's mantel, her rifle rested next to Rhett's father's. Her burlap boots hung below like silent witnesses. Seasons came and went around the cabin beside the narrow stream, pine needles drifting across the snow in winter, new leaves trembling in spring breezes, and golden light shading the valley in autumn. In the spring, Rhett welcomed broken souls, a boy named Eli, who claimed June had saved his mother from bandits years before, a one-armed veteran scarred by war, a young girl who bore burn marks from a fire she could not escape, and later, a quiet widow whose husband died in a mine collapse. Each arrived wounded in body or heart. Each found something like hope in that remote place. Under Rhett's watchful eye they learned to fish in the stream, set snares for rabbits in the brush, and sow seeds for a garden where radishes and beans grew in summer sun. June's garden, planted before her illness took her, still bloomed with peas and marigolds, and Rhett tended it, as if touching her spirit. He taught each newcomer how to listen to the land, watch the birds for signs of storms, read tracks in the mud, feel the wind on their faces for changes in weather. Many nights they gathered around a fire built on a flat rock by the water's edge. June's sister's braid, encased in glass, hung from a low branch, catching firelight as flames danced. They shared stories by the fire. Eli spoke of his mother's laughter, returned after June's help. The veteran told how he raced back to Mercy's Hollow, even after the war took his arm. The girl burned in past mistakes, wrote small poems in chalk on the cabin's door to remind herself she was still alive. Rhett listened to them, chest heavy with pride and sorrow, and sometimes he closed his eyes and felt June's presence in the whisper of wind through pine needles. He kept June's rifle propped by the hearth as a symbol of strength and mercy entwined. It had ended lives but also protected many. In summer,
Wildflowers carpeted the hills, lupine, yarrow, and daisies that swayed as if bowing to the sky. Children arrived from nearby settlements after word traveled of Mercy's Hollow. They were shy at first, clutching small bundles or hiding scars under wide sleeves. Rhett or Eli would take them fishing, teaching them patience as they waited for trout to nibble on worms, teaching them to trust that life could be gentle. In return, the children brought laughter back to the cabin, soft giggles when a rabbit tunneled near their feet, squeals when deer emerged from the woods at dawn. Sometimes June's spirit felt so near that on foggy mornings, visitors claimed they saw a woman in ragged clothes by the grave, tending flowers with tender hands. Rhett carved June's name and a small flame into a bench by the stream where he and the newcomers often rested at sunset. He would sit there and trace the carving with calloused fingers, thinking of how she walked through fire for all of them, and how they carried her flame forward. A breeze would stir, and he fancied he could hear her whisper, "Stand tall, carry hope." Often he would take Eli to the woods and tell him about his mother's heroism, how June had guided the boy and his mother to safety through a blizzard. Eli would nod solemnly, the memory a promise to be brave. As the years passed, the cabin grew with additions, a small nursery where women who had lost children could cradle infants in rooms warmed by a wood stove, a workshop where veterans reshaped metal scraps into tools instead of weapons, and a library of tattered books on medicine, farming and law, donated by travelers who found Mercy's Hollow and stayed to help build it. A bell hung above the door, rung to call everyone to supper or to signal danger when a sudden storm or a bear wandering too close threatened the peaceful valley. Under Rhett's direction, they built a footbridge across the stream that arched like a wooden smile over rushing water, symbolizing the bridge from sorrow to sanctuary. When newcomers stepped onto that bridge, they left behind pain and doubt, and took steps toward healing. One winter, a young man named Samuel arrived with frostbitten hands, and memories of battles he could not escape. June had once sewn his uniform when he was just a boy, and he stayed at Mercy's Hollow until his hands healed enough to carve little wooden birds that now perched on the shelves by the hearth. A family of 4 who lost their farm in a flood came and helped plant apple trees in the orchard. Rhett and Eli had started. They laughed again as they pressed fresh cider and tracked rabbits in the snow, trusting that life could still be sweet. A widowed blacksmith learned to shape horseshoes again, forging each nail as a prayer for the future and leaving one behind on June's grave, as a token of gratitude. Each morning Rhett still rose before dawn, patting his pockets for the keys to the barn, and paused by June's grave to whisper his daily promise, "She walked through fire for all of us. Now we carry her flame." The carved initials on the bench had dulled from years of weather, but each visitor touched it reverently before stepping onto the bridge to join the community. Under his watch, Mercy's Hollow never closed its door. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, and even as Rhett's hair grayed, his spirit remained steadfast. Sometimes loneliness visited him like a shadow at dusk, and he would sit by the grave until moonlight silvered the pine needles. In those moments a gentle wind carried a whisper of June's laughter, and he knew she was with them still. In midsummer, when the world outside was filled with heat and dust storms, Mercy's Hollow held a festival by the stream. The travelers brought wild strawberries and jam they made from juniper berries. Rhett and other men fished in the sunrise light, and brought trout for the feast. Women set up tables under a canopy of elm trees, draping quilts June had sewn across them. Children ran barefoot in circles around the fire pit, their laughter ringing until stars appeared. When dusk fell, they danced to fiddle music played by the one-armed veteran who tapped his foot despite his injury. Mercy's Hollow echoed with music and stories of redemption that carried over the hills and beckoned weary souls to follow. Many stopped on dusty roads, saw the flickering lantern by the stream, and decided to turn their wagons toward the distant bells' chime. One traveler, a crippled old man with rheumy eyes, knelt by June's grave, and placed a small packet of letters, stories he had saved from his family's home before a bandit raid took everything. He thanked June for her mercy even though they had never met. In autumn, leaves turned copper and gold, and they held a ceremony planting a young cedar tree on June's grave, so that when it grew, its branches would stretch like arms of welcome. Rhett carved tiny wooden plaques reading hope, courage, and mercy into its bark. Visitors left stones at the base of the tree with their names, marking their personal journeys from suffering to strength. A timid girl who arrived with a broken voice found her song again as she sang lullabies to orphaned lambs, rescued by the local shepherd. Her voice grew strong and summer birds paused to listen. Later in winter's hush, when snow muffled footsteps on the bridge, a lone traveler knocked on the cabin's door carrying a violin. He claimed June had once helped him find water in a drought, and though he was a stranger, he carried her legacy in the melody he played. The notes floated across fields of snow, and Rhett felt the threads of life weave together again. As Mercy's hollow grew, the boundaries between the past and future blurred. What began as a refuge became a home full of memories new and old. Still, each soul who arrived bore a quiet reverence for the woman who had walked through fire and taught them that mercy could transform even the hardest heart. In the flicker of morning light, dew on grass or the rustle of pine boughs, her spirit whispered that no wound was too deep to heal. And so Mercy's hollow thrived in silence and song, holding all who came in its gentle embrace.